Our guest today is Sharon Ward, the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center, a think tank based here in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Great to have you with us, Sharon. This is the one time of year when it's really everybody's discussion point at the dinner table to talk about the governor's budget. The governor came back again this year for the second time with an austere budget. Can you give us a general view of how the Budget and Policy Center sees this hold the line or cutback budget?
Sure. I think as we've said with the budget last year, it continues many of the same themes. I think it's a budget that's largely out of step with middle-class Pennsylvanians. Once again, the governor makes a big cut to higher education programs, or proposes a big cut to higher education programs. I think that's very much out of step with what middle-class Pennsylvania families want. And although this is a flat budget, in fact, it masks a number of very large cuts. In addition to higher education, there's a very large cut in the Department of Public Welfare to the General Assistance Program. I don't think a lot of people are talking about this, but it's a very small benefit program for very low-income disabled, mostly adults, and it's a big dollar amount, about $319 million. More than 60,000 people will lose that benefit if this budget is enacted.
And this is money that does not come from the federal government. It's $300 million in state dollars.
That's correct.
And then what kind of people generally tend to end up on general assistance?
Actually, most people are receive general assistance benefits for temporarily. So, for example, if a family is homeless, they can apply for general assistance, and that helps them to make some payments, or to either to help stay in a shelter or to live until they're able to find permanent housing. Victims of domestic violence often are able to get general assistance benefits because many of them leave everything behind from an abusive relationship, and they need something to tide them over. For others, it's very disabled people who are so disabled they've applied for Social Security benefits, but they're awaiting the determination. And this is one of those instances where the state will actually lose money, because if someone's applied for Social Security benefits and once they receive it, the state is able to recoup some money from Social Security for that. So again, has there been special pressure for this program because of the recession, or why cut it at this point?
Not
so much this program. This really is a fill-in program for people who are really very disabled or very ill before they move into another situation.
So where do they turn now then, if this is?
Well, I think the argument, and this will be a theme that we'll hear about the other cuts that the governor has proposed, is you take away what's essentially a small transitional benefit for someone, and you end up having to pay more down the road. People end up in jails, they'll end up in institutions. It seems that we'll end up paying more for these folks than we might otherwise had this temporary benefit not been available.
Yeah, one of the commitments made 2 decades ago, when we started closing mental hospitals and mental health facilities, was that we were going to take care of them at the community level. Aren't there substantial cutbacks in this budget for community mental health?
There are. The governor has proposed a block grant, the Human Services Development Block Grant, and within it would consolidate a number of programs that are administered at the county level. The bulk of those are mental health, behavioral health programs. And there's a great deal of concern about that, because the counties, the cut in that program is about 20%. It goes to a whole variety of mental health programs, and there's not going to be a 20% reduction in the number of people who need that service. So again, I think counties are really scrambling to figure out how they're going to manage with greatly reduced dollars. And although the County Commissioners Association has been supportive of this notion and has been agreed with the concept that counties should have mandate relief and also greater flexibility for their dollars, I'm not sure anybody expected a 20% cut, and it seems that this is not the way to do it. I mean, if you want to move towards making efficiencies and doing things differently, I think it makes sense for all involved to do it gradually, to give people time to plan. That didn't happen in this case at all. It's a consolidation, and it's a very large cut that I think the county's going to have a very hard time managing.
Yeah. Don't want to be bouncing around, but when you mention 20%, it reminds me that another area where there's a major cut is 20 to 30% in state support for higher education. Want to talk about what those impacts are?
You know, it's funny, Tony, we did an analysis of the governor's budget, and what we found was that if the budget's enacted next year, Pennsylvania will spend twice as much on prisons as it does on colleges and universities. And we'll have seen about a 54% reduction in higher education spending. That's pretty significant. And I think it speaks to the direction that this governor is going. You know, from our perspective, there are things that are beneficial to the economy. I mean, Pennsylvania has an economy that is largely based on education and health care. We don't have the same economy as other states, and yet the governor's cuts seem to be directed at those areas of the economy on which Pennsylvanians depend. So I think this is really very short-sighted.
Two arguments that we've heard, though, already from people defending the cuts. One is that the colleges, the state-related universities, and to a lesser degree the state-owned universities, don't need the money. The grant money only accounts for 2% perhaps of their overall budgets. The other one is that too many kids go to college. We don't need as many people in college. What say you about that point?
Well, let me start with the latter. It's absolutely clear in everything that all of the data that a college education is key to getting a job in this economy. Gone are the days where you can really graduate with a high school diploma and get a job that can sustain a family. So that is that statement is not backed up by any of the data. More so, it is an absolute, I think, it flies in the face of every family's value. You know, I can't imagine turning to people and saying, your kid doesn't need a college education anymore. Most parents really put vast amount of resources and their own personal resources in making sure that their kids can get a good education, because that they know that that's the key to a quality job. So again, I have to say, I really think the governor is just really out of touch with what middle-class families want in this state and what they need. We are a state that has not grown. Our population doesn't grow very much. We continue to age, and it's as though the governor's sending a message to people that says, if you want to live in a community with a quality school and the chance for your kid to go to a good college that he or she can afford, you need to move to another state. And let me just finish my rant by saying that, you know, states that are Pennsylvania's economic competitors, North Carolina, Georgia, other states like that, they actually they invest significantly in higher education. I mean, one of the keys to the growth in Georgia's economy is the fact that they guarantee that any kid that graduates from high school with a B average can go to and get a significant scholarship to a state college. What kid wouldn't stay in a state given that benefit? So again, it's very short-sighted.
And then there's the feedback from at least one of the state-related university presidents that they'll go private if they get much less support. How would that harm families if they went private?
Well, I can tell you in my own family, my son went to school at Temple University and it was $18,000, and my daughter went to school at the University of Miami and it was $50,000. It will absolutely put these colleges out of reach for Pennsylvania families. And that's not the direction that I think this state needs to go. Mm-hmm.
Before I dig more into the little nitty-gritties of the budget, is there some general overview you'd want to offer? I mean, just picking on the governor and saying spending less money, it isn't necessarily persuasive. Is there something the governor ought to be doing or the legislature ought to be doing to more fairly support worthwhile programs without breaking the budget?
Sure. We understand that Pennsylvania is still suffering from the recession, that our tax revenue hasn't returned as quickly as we might have hoped. But I think there are three things. One is, I don't think the economic outlook is as bad as the governor has suggested. And with a $500 million surplus we're sitting on and the current year budgetary reserves, right at this moment where we'll end the year most likely with no deficit whatsoever. If the revenue shortfall this year is less than Secretary Zogby is estimating, then we will end the year with a surplus. So let's start there. Second, we think really the governor needs, and the legislature need to look at the tax spending side of the budget. That we need to
tax spending.
Yes, that there's spending that you see on the budget book, but there's also spending in the tax code. For a number of tax credit programs that are not evaluated, perhaps it's time to evaluate some of those and maybe reduce them. And then we think that there are tax breaks and loopholes that the General Assembly ought to close. The governor is actually moving in that direction. Has proposed in the budget capping the sales tax vendor discount for retailers. They keep some of their sales tax collections that they send back to the state. And the governor's also investing actually in tax enforcement, and those are things that we support. We think he's moving in the right direction, but they need to do so more aggressively.
One of the things the Budget and Policy Center has advocated strongly over the past couple of years is taxing Marcellus shale drilling. We now have a program to raise revenue. Some call it a tax, some call it anything but a tax. But in practice, how do you think that will work out? Is it too much, too late, good enough, could be better? What?
Too little, too late, too complicated. All of those things. The tax rate is very low. It's among the lowest in the country. It's incredibly complex in the way in which it's being implemented. And frankly, we think the General Assembly should have done something different from that. That being said, they've instituted something. I think local governments do need the relief, although they have paid a tremendous price for getting some assistance with the drilling-related costs. The precedent in it is that a share of the money goes to statewide initiatives and a share to local governments, and that I think at least is moving in the right direction.
If you could get the legislature to act next week or next month, what 2 or 3 things would you want them to do to make this budget more palatable from your viewpoint?
Well, I think, frankly, we do need additional revenue in order to support the budget. So I would say that they should move forward within the next couple of months in closing corporate tax loopholes. State Representative Dave Reed has a bill supported by the House Republican leadership that would close the loopholes would close the loopholes. I'll just leave it at that. Through some changes in the tax code. We'd argue that that moves in the right direction. His bill would use that money for tax relief. We think that should be deferred at this point until we can afford it. I would put off the capital stock and franchise tax reduction as well. I think those two
how much
things,
money in capital stock and tax?
That could be about $260 million next year. So between the two of those, I think you could raise enough money that you could then, I would then restore some of the higher ed cuts. I'd keep the general assistance program, and I would restore at least a portion.
You're advocating not raising taxes, but collecting more income by more fairly enforcing the taxes and postponing some reductions?
Isn't that exactly what I just said?
That's what I just... Well, we're agreed there.
We think that the General Assembly would be able to raise revenue in a way that makes the tax code more fair and doesn't involve any broad-based tax increases. And that in doing so would protect the economy and make the investments that are necessary that actually will help our economy to grow moving forward.
Basic education. There are what people are calling hidden cuts there. Can you talk about that a bit?
Sure. I think that most school districts are still reeling from the large cuts that were enacted last year. We know a number of the school districts, particularly those that serve lower income students, got a really big hit, and there have been lots of layoffs. I think our numbers are about 13,000 jobs were lost in the education sector, which is pretty significant. So that's probably the biggest issue. And as in the Department of Public Welfare, the governor has proposed a block grant and simply consolidated a number of line items, including the basic ed subsidy and also the transportation and a couple of other things, without any increase. So the school districts are once again either going to have to eat, additional costs that they're incurring, or go back to the local taxpayer.
I got a letter just this last week from a school district where I used to live, saying that they would they're abandoning band and sports, and we're looking for donations from people in the community to keep. That's as an alternative to a local tax increase. Is that something you're seeing generally, or is it common to?
I met somebody who said that their child came home and asked the parents to donate toilet paper to the school because they couldn't afford it. And I know that in Allentown, the superintendent there talked about the fact that their their high school students are spending more time in study hall because they've had to eliminate a lot of electives. Again, we are in a global economy. Our kids are going to be competing with people around the world, and yet we're ending band and music and sports and ending electives that kids are going to need when they get to college.
What's the bottom line here? Do you think there is a will in the General Assembly to more fully fund programs as an alternative to local tax increases, or we're going to see this budget as inevitable?
I don't think so. I think that the General Assembly will likely tinker somewhat with this budget. I'm not sure that, given the impacts that we've seen from last year's budget cuts, that they're willing to go through that again. That said, they're going to have to take some action, I think, on the revenue side in order to restore the cuts in a significant way.
Doing triage, if you had only one thing that you could save or one action you could really fight for, is there one program that you think really needs to be restored or remedied?
It's hard to say at this point. I think we need to see some of the restoration to higher education. I think there might be a way to, on the general assistance side, there might be a way to some creative ways to maybe draw down some federal funds that might be able to save at least the healthcare portion of that program. And I just don't think that counties can sustain a 20% cut in their funding. So, we don't advocate for one thing in particular. I think all of these things have significant impacts. The county cuts are going to increase taxes at the local level. Higher education, I think, just moves us in the wrong direction as a state. And with general assistance, we're going to end up really hurting very, very vulnerable people and costing more down the road.
The Budget and Policy Center acts pretty much as sort of a resource, a research resource, a source for legislators for facts, statistics. What next steps do you see in this budget process for your organization?
Well, I think a couple of things. First, we want to make sure that that the people we work with understand the budget in total, and they understand the arguments that will be made, and we would like to help them to refute some of those arguments. I think the second thing we will do is work together as a group to help advocate for some of the revenue alternatives that we think are necessary to restore the cuts. You know, frankly, we've had some success with that. There's a drilling tax. The governor's proposed the vendor discount. There's actually movement on internet sales, largely driven by the retailers and some others in the business community. But again, these are all good steps to make the tax system more fair and raise additional revenue. So we'll continue to promote those. And I think in part what we want to do is make the case that there is an alternative to what the governor's proposed, and actually it's better for Pennsylvania than the path that he's chosen to take.
We've been talking to Sharon Ward of the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Tony.